In the summer of 323 BC, the most powerful man in the world lay dying in a palace in Babylon. He was 32 years old. He had never lost a battle. He had marched his army from Greece to the borders of India, crossed deserts that swallowed lesser men whole, and brought down the oldest empire on earth. In 11 years, he had done what no one before him had even seriously attempted. He had conquered the known world. And when he died, it took his generals less than an afternoon to begin tearing it apart. Within a year, the empire was fracturing. Within a generation, it was gone. Not conquered by some greater power, not dismantled by a superior civilization rising in the east. Simply gone, dissolved from within, like a structure that looked solid from the outside and had nothing holding it up. The greatest military mind in human history had built the largest empire the world had ever seen, and left behind almost nothing designed to last. That is the question worth sitting with. Not how he won, but what exactly he thought winning was for. To understand what Alexander failed to build, you first have to understand what he actually was, because nothing about it was ordinary. He was born in 356 BC in Pella, the capital of Macedonia, a kingdom on the northern edge of the Greek world that the older city-states barely considered civilized. His father, Philip II, had spent 20 years turning that peripheral kingdom into the dominant military power in the Aegean. Alexander inherited that army at 20. He also inherited Philip's debts, Philip's enemies, and a coalition of subject peoples watching to see whether the son was anything like the father. He was not like the father. He was something else entirely. Philip was a strategist, patient, political, willing to wait years for an advantage. Alexander was a force of nature operating at a different speed. Within 2 years of taking the throne, he had crushed rebellions in Thrace and Illyria, razed Thebes to the ground as a warning to the rest of Greece, and crossed into Asia Minor at the head of an army of roughly 40,000 men. He had no treasury to speak of, enough supplies for perhaps 30 days, and a plan that everyone around him privately considered suicidal. The army he led was a precision instrument. Philip had built the Macedonian phalanx, long sarissa spears, tight formations, and a discipline beyond anything the Greek world had previously fielded. Alexander inherited that instrument and used it as half of a tactical system. The other half was the companion cavalry, the hetairoi, shock troops he commanded personally from the front. The phalanx held the enemy in place. The cavalry found the gap and broke through it. It was a hammer and anvil strategy, and in Alexander's hands it was almost impossible to stop. At the Granicus River in 334 BC, he faced his first major Persian engagement. The satrapal army, Persian regional governors who had dismissed the invasion as a frontier nuisance, lined their cavalry along the far bank of the river and waited. By every conventional calculation, crossing under fire was reckless. Alexander crossed immediately, drove straight for the Persian commanders, and nearly died when a Persian aristocrat's sword came down at the back of his helmet and broke the entire engagement in less than an hour. Asia Minor opened up in front of him. At Issus in 333 BC, he faced Darius III himself. The Persian king had managed to outmaneuver Alexander strategically, cutting off the Macedonian supply line and forcing a battle on ground of Darius's choosing, with a river between them and a Persian army that outnumbered the Macedonians several times over. Alexander attacked anyway. He personally led the companion cavalry in a diagonal charge that collapsed the Persian left flank, then wheeled inward toward Darius. Darius fled. His mother, wife, and children fell into Macedonian hands. Alexander treated them with deliberate courtesy. Darius had lost the battle before he understood it had started. At Gaugamela in 331 BC, the scale expanded again. Darius had spent 2 years rebuilding his army. He had chosen an open plain, had it cleared and leveled to give his cavalry room to operate, and had assembled a force that ancient sources estimated at over 1 million. a number no serious historian accepts, but which reflects how overwhelming the Persian host appeared to those who faced it. Modern estimates run to around 100,000 against Alexander's 40,000. The Persian line extended so far beyond the Macedonian flanks that encirclement seemed inevitable. Alexander saw it coming and used it. He marched his entire line obliquely to the right, dragging Bessus and the Bactrian cavalry out of position, thinning the Persian center, creating a gap. Then he charged through it with the companions aimed directly at Darius, as the Persian king fled again. The battle lasted most of a day and decided the fate of an empire. 3 battles, 3 decisive victories, and 3 times Alexander had put himself in the place where the killing happened. He was not a general who directed from behind. He was the weapon itself. That willingness to lead from the front was not recklessness in the ordinary sense. It was calculated. Alexander understood that his army's morale was inseparable from his visible presence in the most dangerous place on the field. He had watched his father operate, had studied the campaigns of Xenophon, had absorbed the lessons of Epaminondas and Iphicrates. He was a student of war in the way that prodigies are students of anything, absorbing everything available and then surpassing it. Aristotle had taught him as a boy, and the education showed, not in philosophy, but in the way his mind processed problems faster than other minds. The sieges showed a different face of the same intelligence. At Miletus, at Halicarnassus, at Tyre, which had held out against Nebuchadnezzar for 13 years and was built on an island half a mile offshore, Alexander found solutions that no one had previously imagined. He dismantled the ruins of old Tyre and built a causeway across the sea. It took 7 months. When Tyre finally fell, the causeway silted over and became permanent land. The island city is connected to the mainland to this day. That is how Alexander's mind worked. He did not solve problems. He made them irrelevant. The speed of the whole enterprise was what made it feel almost supernatural to those who watched it. He covered distances that should have taken months in weeks. He appeared outside cities before the news of his approach had arrived. He marched his army through the Hindu Kush in winter. He crossed the Gedrosian desert on the return from India, losing 1/3 of his force to heat and starvation, and emerged on the other side, still in command, still planning. There is no modern analogy that quite captures what it meant to watch this man operate in the 4th century BC. His contemporaries reached for myth because nothing else was large enough. The personal magnetism compounded the military genius. Alexander knew every officer in his army by name. He remembered acts of individual courage performed years before and rewarded them publicly. He ate what his soldiers ate, slept where they slept, bled from the same kind of wounds. At the siege of Multan in India, he was struck by an arrow that drove deep into his chest. His officers wept, believing him dead. He survived, appeared before the army on a stretcher to prove it, then mounted a horse to make them stop worrying. He understood intuitively that an army's belief in its commander is itself a military asset. He was also capable of savagery that his admirers prefer to explain away. The destruction of Thebes, a city razed, its population enslaved, was a political calculation as much as an act of rage, a warning to Greece that resistance had a cost. The killing of the Greek mercenaries at Granicus, men who had laid down arms and expected to be spared, shocked even his own officers. The burning of Persepolis was either a drunken accident or a deliberate act of revenge for the Persian sack of Athens 150 years earlier. The sources disagree, but the fire was real, and the city was Alexander's to protect. He could be generous to the point of extravagance and brutal to the point of atrocity, sometimes in the same week. What held all of this together, the genius, the magnetism, the violence, the ambition, was a self-conception so total that it functioned almost like a physical force. Alexander believed he was descended from Achilles through his mother Olympias, and from Heracles through his father Philip. He was not using these lineages merely as political propaganda, the way a modern politician invokes founding fathers. He appears to have understood them as lived reality, and as a framework for what he was and what he was therefore obligated to attempt. The oracle at Siwa confirmed his divine parentage. He took the confirmation seriously. This was a man for whom the boundary between human and divine had become genuinely unclear. The men around him ranged from devoted to privately terrified. Hephaestion, his closest companion and almost certainly his closest friend, seems to have understood Alexander in a way no one else did and never questioned the project. Craterus was loyal but conventional. Parmenion, the veteran general inherited from Philip, was cautious and careful and frequently overruled. Ptolemy watched everything and recorded what he chose to record, already calculating. These men were gifted by any standard. Around Alexander, they were satellites, present, useful, and fundamentally secondary. And by the time the Macedonian army reached Persepolis in 330 BC, less than 4 years after crossing the Hellespont, the Achaemenid Empire was functionally over. Darius was dead, murdered by his own satrap Bessus while trying to flee. Persia's treasure, one of the largest accumulations of wealth in the ancient world, was in Macedonian hands. 3 of the 4 great Persian capitals had fallen. Alexander had done what he came to do. He stood at the center of the known world with every resource on earth available to him and no enemy left who could stop him. And he chose to keep going. That choice, to keep going, is where the story most people know ends and the real question begins. Because everything that followed, the march into Bactria and Sogdia, the invasion of India, the long and catastrophic return through the Gedrosian desert, and the plans for Arabia and beyond, all of it was conquest without consolidation, expansion without foundation. The machine that had been so perfectly calibrated for winning territory had no setting for keeping it. And by the time that became undeniable, it was too late to do anything about it. In the weeks after Issus, while the Macedonian army was still processing what it had just done, a letter arrived from Darius III. The Persian king was writing from somewhere in the east, rebuilding his forces, and he was willing to deal. The terms were serious. Darius offered everything west of the Euphrates, all of Asia Minor, Cilicia, Syria, plus a ransom of 10,000 talents for his captured family, plus a permanent alliance. It was, by any conventional measure, an extraordinary offer. Alexander had crossed into Asia with debts and 30 days of supplies. He was now being offered half a continent and a peace treaty with the most powerful king on earth. Parmenion, the senior general who had served Philip and survived long enough to serve Alexander, heard the terms and gave his honest assessment. If he were Alexander, he said, he would accept. Alexander's reply has been quoted ever since. So would I, he said, if I were Parmenion. It was a perfect line, dismissive, witty, final. It was also the first moment in the campaign where the question of what exactly Alexander was building became impossible to avoid. Parmenion was thinking about security, consolidation, a defensible empire. Alexander was thinking about something else entirely. He always had been. The rejection of Darius's offer was not impulsive, yet Alexander had considered it carefully enough to know he was going to refuse before he convened the council. What he told his generals was strategic. Darius would rebuild his army regardless of any treaty. The Persian fleet still threatened Greece. The western satrapies would never be stable while the Achaemenid king remained on his throne in the east. These were real arguments. They were also convenient ones. The deeper truth was simpler. Alexander had no interest in stopping. The campaign was not a means to a political end. The campaign was the point. This is the distinction that the standard accounts of Alexander tend to miss, or to frame as heroic ambition rather than structural choice. Every ruler who builds an empire faces, at some point, the same crossroads. You can keep expanding, or you can begin the slower, a harder work of making what you have hold together. The two projects require different skills, different temperaments, different relationships with time. Expansion rewards speed, boldness, the willingness to outpace your enemy's ability to respond. Consolidation rewards patience, institutional imagination, the ability to bind strangers together under systems they find legitimate. Alexander had the first set of qualities in abundance. He had almost none of the second. And Odysseus, with the offer from Darius in his hand, he made the choice that defined everything that followed. Not because he was foolish, but because the consolidation project genuinely held no interest for him. He understood war. He had been trained for it since childhood, mythologized within it, defined by it. The administration of a stable empire was a different kind of problem, and it was not his kind of problem. He marched south into Phoenicia. The Phoenician cities, Byblos, Sidon, Arwad, surrendered in sequence, their kings calculating which way the wind was blowing. Tyre refused, and Alexander spent 7 months building a causeway across the sea to take it, then Gaza, then Egypt. Each conquest fed the next. Each victory created new borders that needed defending, new populations that needed managing, new administrators who needed appointing. The empire was getting larger by the month. It was not getting more coherent. Egypt is worth pausing on because it briefly looked like something different. Alexander arrived in 332 BC, and the Egyptians received him as a liberator, not metaphorically, but with genuine relief. The Persians had ruled Egypt for 2 centuries with a heavy hand, suppressing local religion, taxing the temples, treating the country as a resource to be extracted rather than a civilization to be governed. Alexander did the opposite. He sacrificed to the Egyptian gods. He visited the oracle at Siwa and returned with the confirmation of his divine parentage that he had, on some level, been looking for his whole life. He appointed Egyptian administrators to run the civil bureaucracy and kept Greeks and Macedonians in military command. A genuine separation of powers. He also founded Alexandria. The site was chosen personally, a strip of land between the sea and Lake Mareotis, with natural harbors on both sides and a position that could anchor Mediterranean trade for centuries. Alexander reportedly sketched the layout himself, using grain to mark the streets on the ground when no chalk was available. The city that grew from that sketch became, within 50 years, the largest and most cosmopolitan city in the Western world. The library, the Mouseion, the lighthouse. All of it grew from a decision Alexander made in a few days in the winter of 331 BC. And then he left. The administrative arrangements in Egypt were more thoughtful than anything he had done elsewhere. But they were still arrangements made quickly by a man who was already thinking about Mesopotamia. The separation of civil and military power, the retention of Egyptian administrators, the respect for local religion. These were not the products of a governing philosophy Alexander intended to carry east with him. They were adaptations to a specific situation, yet driven partly by Egypt's strategic value and partly by Alexander's genuine fascination with Egyptian religion. They did not travel. East of Egypt, in Mesopotamia and Persia proper, the administrative pattern reverted. Satraps were appointed, sometimes Persian nobles whose local legitimacy was useful, sometimes Macedonians whose loyalty was assumed, sometimes men chosen for reasons that are no longer clear. The appointments were made quickly, often on the move, with Alexander already focused on the next campaign. There was no standardized system of oversight, no regular mechanism for reviewing how a satrap was governing, no institutional check on what happened in a province once the army had passed through it. Darius made one more offer before he died. In 331 BC, from Gaugamella's aftermath, he proposed terms even more generous than before. 10,000 talents, all land west of the Euphrates, a daughter in marriage, a permanent alliance. Alexander refused again, in language that made the refusal personal. He was the king of all Asia now, he wrote back. Darius should address him accordingly. Whatever he possessed was already Alexander's. The letter was not diplomacy. It was a declaration that the question of terms was closed. There would be no negotiated settlement because there was nothing to negotiate. Alexander intended to have everything. The pursuit of Darius that followed the Battle of Gaugamela was not just a military operation. It was a statement about what kind of ruler Alexander intended to be. He was not fighting Darius for territory. He was fighting him for legitimacy. As long as the Achaemenid king lived, he was a potential focal point for resistance, a figure around whom the eastern satrapies could rally. Alexander needed Darius dead or captured to claim not just the Persian lands, but the Persian throne. He was not replacing the Achaemenid Empire. He was inheriting it. That ambition, to be not just the conqueror of Persia, but its legitimate successor, shaped every administrative decision Alexander made from Gaugamela onward. He began wearing elements of Persian court dress. He adopted Achaemenid ceremonial protocols. He appointed Persian nobles to satrapal positions. He presented himself to Persian populations as a continuation of their royal tradition, not as a foreign occupier. These were intelligent, even sophisticated political moves. They were also moves that horrified his Macedonian officers, who had crossed into Asia on the promise of Greek revenge against the Persian barbarian and were now watching their king dress like one. The tension between those two audiences, the Macedonian army that had won the empire and the Persian populations that needed to be governed, was one Alexander never resolved. He managed it case by case, concession by concession, until managing it consumed more and more of the energy that might otherwise have gone into building durable institutions. The empire was becoming a performance of legitimacy staged simultaneously for incompatible audiences, held together by the charisma of the single figure at its center. What happened when that figure was no longer there was a question no one was allowed to ask. Egypt in 332 BC was not a country waiting to be conquered. It was a country waiting to be rescued. The Persians had taken it by force in 525 BC under Cambyses, lost it to a native revolt in 404 BC, and retaken it in 343 BC under Artaxerxes III. That second reconquest had been brutal. Temples desecrated, sacred animals slaughtered, local elites humiliated. The Egyptians had spent a generation under administrators who treated their civilization as a subordinate inconvenience. When Alexander's army appeared at Pelusium, the Persian governor Mazasis looked at his position, calculated his odds, and surrendered without a fight. The population that greeted the Macedonians was not cheering for Alexander specifically. They were cheering for the end of something else. Alexander understood the difference, and it shaped everything he did in Egypt. He did not arrive as a conqueror performing magnanimity. He arrived as a ruler performing legitimacy, and the distinction mattered enormously. He sacrificed to the Egyptian gods immediately, including Apis, the sacred bull, whose cult the Persians had reportedly defiled. He attended the traditional ceremonies. He dressed for the religious contexts in the way Egyptian tradition required. Whether he believed any of it is beside the point. He understood that in Egypt, religious authority and political authority were not separate things. A ruler who ignored the gods was not just impious. He was, by Egyptian logic, not really a ruler at all. The administrative structure he imposed on Egypt was the most sophisticated he ever attempted anywhere. He divided the country into two civil governorships, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, each run by an Egyptian official answerable to the existing bureaucratic tradition. Military command went to Greeks and Macedonians, kept deliberately separate from civil administration. The treasury was managed by Cleomenes of Naucratis, a Greek with commercial experience. The garrisons at Memphis and Pelusium were Macedonian. Each layer of authority had its own chain of command, its own reporting structure, its own sphere. For a conqueror operating at Alexander's speed, it was a remarkably layered arrangement. The logic behind the separation was sound. Egyptian administrators knew Egypt. They knew the tax records, the irrigation systems, the temple hierarchies, the local disputes that had been simmering for decades. A Macedonian governor dropped into that context would have been dependent on interpreters and local fixers for everything, vulnerable to manipulation, and resented besides. By keeping Egyptians in civil roles, Alexander gained administrative competence he could not have manufactured himself, and he purchased something rarer, a degree of local legitimacy that did not depend entirely on military terror. The founding of Alexandria belongs in this picture, though it is usually treated as a separate achievement. The site Alexander chose in January of 331 BC was not random. The strip of land between the Mediterranean and Lake Mareotis gave the city two harbor systems, one facing the sea and one facing the Nile Delta, which meant it could function simultaneously as a Mediterranean trading port and as the commercial gateway to the Egyptian interior. Alexander had an eye for geography that went beyond military advantage. He was choosing a site designed to accumulate wealth and connectivity across generations, not just to secure a current campaign. He marked the city's boundaries himself, reportedly pacing out the main avenues and designating the sites for the agora, the temples, and the palace district. When his architects ran out of chalk, he used grain from the army's supplies to mark the lines on the ground. A flock of birds descended and ate the grain. His soothsayer read it as an omen of prosperity, that the city would feed multitudes. Alexander accepted the interpretation and moved on. Within his lifetime, and construction was underway. Within 50 years of his death, Alexandria was the largest city in the Mediterranean world, home to the greatest library ever assembled, the center of Greek science and philosophy for 3 centuries. He built one thing that lasted. It was a city. It was the exception. The journey to the oracle at Siwa in February of 331 BC sits at the intersection of the personal and the political in a way that is difficult to disentangle. The oracle of Zeus Ammon at Siwa had been consulted by Croesus of Lydia, by the Athenians before Salamis, by figures whose names carried the weight of history. To seek its counsel was to place yourself in that lineage. Alexander made the journey across 300 miles of Libyan desert with a small party in conditions that should have been impassable. Water ran out, a sandstorm obliterated the trail, and arrived at the oasis in late February looking like a man who had decided the desert could not stop him because he had decided it could not. What the priest said to him inside the temple is not known with certainty. The sources disagree in ways that cannot be reconciled. What Alexander told people afterward is clear enough. The oracle had confirmed that his father was not Philip of Macedon, but Zeus himself. He was divine. He had always been divine. The oracle had simply named what was already true. He returned to his army with something that cannot be measured in military terms, an absolute internal certainty about his own nature that would drive everything he did for the remaining 8 years of his life. And that would create, in time, the most intractable institutional problem his empire faced. Back in Memphis, before he left Egypt for good, Alexander spent several weeks settling the administration and receiving embassies. He was generous, attentive, clearly energized by the Egyptian context in a way he had not been everywhere. He genuinely found Egyptian religion fascinating, the antiquity of it, the scale of it, the way it organized an entire civilization around a cosmology that predated Greece by 2,000 years. He was not performing interest. The interest was real. And it produced in Egypt a quality of administrative attention that he rarely sustained anywhere else. The question that Egypt raises, and that the rest of Alexander's career answers in the negative, is whether the Egyptian model was exportable. The separated civil and military authority, the retention of local administrators, the careful adaptation to indigenous religious tradition, these were not accidental features of Egypt's arrangement. They were responses to specific conditions, a deeply rooted priestly bureaucracy, a population with a long memory of Persian misrule, a geographic configuration that made Egypt simultaneously essential and self-contained. Alexander read those conditions correctly and responded to them appropriately. The problem was that he read them as local conditions requiring local solutions, not as general principles requiring systematic application. East of Egypt, in Mesopotamia and Persia, the local conditions were different, but the underlying logic was the same. Babylon had its own priestly hierarchy, its own administrative tradition, its own ancient institutions of governance that had survived Assyrian conquest, Chaldean rule, and in Persian occupation. Susa had its bureaucracy. Persepolis had its ceremonial significance. A ruler genuinely committed to institutional consolidation would have approached each of these centers the way he approached Memphis, learning the local structure, working within it, adapting his authority to its existing logic. Alexander did this partially, intermittently, when it was convenient. He never made it a method. The appointment of Cleomenes as financial overseer of Egypt illustrates the limits of what Alexander built there. Cleomenes was competent, but he was also left without meaningful oversight. Within a few years, he had turned his financial authority into something approaching personal extortion, manipulating grain prices, extracting bribes from the temples, enriching himself at Egypt's expense. Alexander, by then deep in Bactria, received complaints and sent letters. The letters had no mechanism behind them. Cleomenes continued, "The administrative structure Alexander had built in Egypt was better than anything he built elsewhere, and it still depended at every critical point on the personal authority of a man who was no longer there. That absence, structural, not just physical, is what Egypt ultimately reveals." Alexander could build something that looked like governance when he was present to animate it. He could read a situation, make intelligent arrangements, even display a genuine instinct for what a stable administration required. But the arrangements he made were organized around his own continued involvement, not around systems that could function without him. And Egypt's administrative structure outlasted Alexander only because Ptolemy, one of his senior generals, seized it immediately after Alexander's death and spent the next 40 years rebuilding it from the foundations up. What Ptolemy built in Egypt was durable. What Alexander had built was a sketch. There is a version of Alexander, the version Egypt briefly makes imaginable, who slows down after Gaugamela, consolidates the western provinces, builds genuine administrative infrastructure across Syria and Mesopotamia, and creates something that might have held. It is not an impossible version. The intelligence was there. The instinct was occasionally there, as Egypt shows. What was not there was the will. The campaign had become, for Alexander, the only reality that mattered. Egypt was an interlude. The East was where he was going. Yes, and East was where everything built on Egyptian principles, the separation of powers, the local legitimacy, the administrative layering, was quietly left behind. By 330 BC, Alexander controlled more territory than any single ruler in history. The Achaemenid Empire, which had taken 2 centuries and a succession of formidable kings to assemble, had fallen in less than 4 years. Macedonia, Greece, Asia Minor, the Levant, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Persia proper. The entire arc of the civilized world from the Adriatic to the Persian Gulf answered in principle to a 32-year-old Macedonian camped outside Persepolis. The question of how exactly it answered to him, through what mechanisms, under what legal framework, enforced by what institutions, was one the empire had no clear answer to. It answered to him because he was there, because his army was there, and because the memory of what that army had done to Thebes and Tyre and the Persian Gate was still fresh enough to function as policy. That is not governance. That is occupation, sustained by the credible threat of violence. Every durable empire in history has eventually had to solve the same problem. How do you make subject peoples accept your authority, not just when your army is present, but when it is not? The answer, across every civilization that managed it, involves some combination of law, religion, economic integration, and the co-optation of local elites into the imperial system. It requires, above all, time, the patient accumulation of habit and precedent until obedience becomes normal rather than compelled. Alexander had neither the time nor, it appears, the inclination. He was always moving. The army was always moving. The occupation was always fresh. The satrapal system he inherited from the Persians was, in theory, a workable framework. The Achaemenids had governed their enormous empire through regional governors, satraps, who administered their provinces with considerable autonomy, collecting taxes, maintaining order, and fielding military contingents when the king required them. The system had held together for 2 centuries under strong central oversight. Darius I had maintained it through a network of royal inspectors, the king's eyes and ears, who traveled the provinces unannounced, reviewed the satrap's conduct, and reported directly to the crown. The system worked because the king was always, in a meaningful sense, watching. Alexander inherited the framework and gutted the oversight. He appointed satraps, sometimes Persian, sometimes Macedonian, occasionally local nobles whose cooperation seemed useful, and moved on. The royal inspectors disappeared. The regular review mechanism disappeared. What replaced them was Alexander's personal attention, expressed through letters and occasional purges when a satrap's conduct became too conspicuous to ignore. This was not a system. It was the personal authority of one man, transmitted erratically across distances that made response times measured in months. A satrap in Bactria who received a reprimand from Alexander was receiving a letter from someone 4,000 miles away who had no immediate means of enforcement. The reprimand was only as powerful as the fear it carried, and fear, at 4,000 miles, decays. Thus, the appointments themselves reveal the absence of any coherent governing philosophy. In Babylon, Alexander retained Mazaeus, the Persian satrap, who had commanded the right wing of Darius's army at Gaugamela, and surrendered the city without a fight. The retention was shrewd. Mazaeus had local legitimacy, administrative experience, and a powerful incentive to prove his usefulness. But Alexander also appointed Macedonian officers to oversee the garrison and the treasury separately, creating a layered authority structure that depended on all 3 men cooperating and on Alexander himself being available to arbitrate when they did not. In Egypt, a similar arrangement. In Persia proper, a different one. In every province, a different improvisation. An empire governed by improvisation is an empire governed by its governor. When the governor is competent and loyal, the province functions. When he is incompetent or corrupt or quietly calculating his options, the province deteriorates. And the deterioration may not reach the center for months or years, if it reaches the center at all. Alexander was aware of this problem in the abstract. He occasionally addressed it through spectacular violence, executing satraps who had accumulated too much independent power or too obviously plundered their provinces. These executions were not the product of a review process. They were responses to crises that had already developed beyond the point of quiet correction. He was not preventing abuse. He was punishing it after the fact, when the punishment could still be seen. The army was the empire's only genuinely functional institution. It moved, it obeyed, it enforced. It had a command structure, a logistical apparatus, a disciplinary culture that had been built over decades under Philip and refined under Alexander. When Alexander needed something done, a city taken, a rebellion crushed, a satrap removed, the army could do it. Everything the army could not do: adjudicate property disputes, maintain irrigation systems, collect taxes fairly, integrate new populations into a coherent political community, fell into the gap where institutions should have been. The empire functioned at the speed of military operations and stalled everywhere that military force was not the appropriate tool. The treasury illustrates the problem in its starkest form. At Persepolis alone, Alexander seized 120,000 talents of silver and gold, a sum so large that it required 10,000 mules and 5,000 camels to transport it to Susa. The total wealth captured from the Achaemenid treasuries across the campaign was enough to fund decades of administration, infrastructure, and institutional development. Alexander spent it on the campaign. He paid his soldiers, rewarded his officers, funded the next march, and dispersed lavish gifts to allies and supplicants. He was not building a fiscal infrastructure, a tax system, a mint, a mechanism for generating sustainable revenue from the provinces. He was spending a fortune he had captured, not one he had built. The cities he founded, and he founded many, most of them named Alexandria, were conceived primarily as military settlements, in garrisons planted in conquered territory to anchor Macedonian presence and control the surrounding region. Some of them grew into genuine urban centers over the following centuries. Most did not. The founding pattern was always the same. A site chosen for strategic position, a population of Macedonian veterans settled there, local populations incorporated or displaced as circumstances required, and then the army moved on. There was no accompanying investment in the civic infrastructure, the law courts, the market regulations, the religious endowments, that turned a military settlement into a self-sustaining community. The legal framework of the empire was, in the most precise sense, non-existent. Alexander ruled by personal decree. There was no imperial law code, no equivalent of the legal systems that Rome would later use to bind its provinces into a coherent administrative unit. Different provinces operated under different legal traditions: Macedonian, Greek, Persian, Egyptian, Babylonian. And Alexander made no attempt to harmonize them or to create an overarching legal identity that a subject of the empire, regardless of origin, could appeal to. What unified the empire was not law, but Alexander. He was the law. When he was present, disputes could be resolved by his judgment. When he was absent, they accumulated. The question of succession never received a serious answer. Alexander had no legitimate heir for most of the campaign. His mother Olympias had been working to secure his position in Macedonia since before he left, and her methods, which included the murder of at least one rival claimant, were a reminder that the Macedonian succession was held together by political violence as much as by dynastic logic. Alexander married Roxane, a Bactrian noblewoman, in 327 BC. Partly for political reasons, partly, it seems, from genuine feeling. Roxane was pregnant when Alexander died. The child, born posthumously, would be named Alexander IV. He did not survive to reign, eliminated before he could threaten those who held power. Alexander's failure to secure a succession was not an oversight. It was a structural consequence of building an empire around a single indispensable figure. Indispensable figures cannot be succeeded. They can only be replaced, which is a different thing entirely. The Macedonian officers who surrounded Alexander were themselves part of the problem, though not in the way that is usually emphasized. They were talented men, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antigonus, Lysimachus, Cassander, who would go on after Alexander's death to build kingdoms of their own that lasted for generations. Each of them, in his own domain, would do what Alexander had never done: create a court, a bureaucracy, a succession mechanism, a legal framework. They knew how to build states. They had watched Alexander for years and observed the absence at the center of his enterprise. They were simply unable to supply it while he lived, because Alexander consumed the institutional oxygen in every room he entered. There was no space in Alexander's empire for anyone else's governing intelligence to operate at the level it required. The Proskynesis crisis of 327 BC, Alexander's attempt to introduce the Persian practice of ritual prostration before the king into his Macedonian court, is usually read as a cultural confrontation, Greeks resisting Eastern barbarism. It was also an institutional crisis. Proskynesis in the Persian court was not merely ceremony. It was a physical enactment of the political relationship between the king and his subjects, a visible, repeated acknowledgement of total sovereignty. For Macedonian nobles, who had a tradition of frank speech before their king, who understood their relationship to the throne as one of service rather than submission, the demand was not just humiliating. It was a claim about what kind of political entity the empire was. Alexander wanted it to be a divine monarchy with no institutional check on royal authority. His officers, who had bled across 3 continents for him, wanted something closer to what they had known in Macedonia. The compromise reached, Greeks and Macedonians exempted, Persians required, satisfied no one, and clarified nothing. It was a symptom of the same problem as everything else. Alexander was trying to be 2 different kinds of rulers simultaneously, and the empire had no framework for resolving the contradiction. What Alexander had built, by 327 BC, was the largest personal dominion in human history. It was held together by his army, his legend, his physical presence, and the residual terror of his capacity for destruction. It was administered through improvised arrangements that depended at every critical juncture on his personal judgment. It had no law code, no succession mechanism, no standardized fiscal system, no institutional check on the conduct of its governors, and no legal identity that could survive the removal of the man at its center. Every earlier empire that had faced these problems, the Assyrian, the Babylonian, the Achaemenid, had developed, over generations, at least partial answers. Alexander had been given the Achaemenid answers as a going concern and had stripped them out to keep the machine moving faster. He had not replaced them with anything. There is a word for a political entity whose continuity depends entirely on the life of a single individual. It is not an empire. It is a reign. Alexander's reign was extraordinary. In scale, in speed, in the sheer transformative force it applied to the ancient world. But a reign ends when the man does. And the question of what you have left when the man is gone, what institutions, what laws, what systems, what frameworks for legitimate authority, is the question that every conqueror eventually faces. Alexander, in 11 years of continuous campaign, never found time to answer it, or never found it interesting enough to try. The generals who would divide his world understood this the moment he was gone. They did not fight over the empire because they were selfish or treacherous, though some were both. They fought over it because there was nothing else to do. Alexander had left them no mechanism for collective governance, no agreed succession, no legal framework for resolving competing claims. He had left them an army, a legend, and a set of territories whose only prior organizing principle had just died in a palace in Babylon. They did what men do when a structure collapses. They grabbed what they could reach. That they rebuilt something durable from the pieces is not a tribute to Alexander's legacy. It is a measure of how much work he had left undone. The oracle at Siwa did not create Alexander's belief in his own divinity. It confirmed something he had been living with since childhood. His mother Olympias was a woman of intense religious conviction who practiced the ecstatic rites of Dionysus, handled sacred snakes, and told her son from an early age that his true father was not Philip of Macedon, but Zeus himself, that a divine presence had come to her in the night before her marriage was consummated in the form of a thunderbolt, and that what she had conceived was not an ordinary child. Philip, the story went, had once looked through a crack in Olympias's door, seen the god beside her, won and understood that the son born from that union was not entirely his. Alexander grew up inside this story. By the time he was old enough to question it, he had already organized his sense of self around it. The practical uses of divine ancestry in the ancient world were considerable. A ruler who could claim descent from the gods inhabited a different category of authority than one who had merely inherited a throne or won a battle. Achilles, from whom Alexander claimed descent through Olympias, was the defining figure of Greek heroic tradition, the man who chose glory over longevity, who burned so intensely that ordinary human life could not contain him. Heracles, the other ancestor, was a god who had begun as a man, whose labors had benefited all of humanity, whose suffering and eventual apotheosis told a story about what extraordinary human beings were for. To be descended from both was to carry a specific obligation, to do things that only a demigod could do, and to do them at a cost that only a demigod could absorb. At Siwa, the priest greeted Alexander, whether by design or by accident of pronunciation the sources disagree, as the son of Zeus Ammon. Alexander received the greeting as confirmation. He returned from the desert with something that cannot be measured in military terms, a certainty about his own nature that was, from that point forward, non-negotiable. He was not claiming divinity as a political tool, though he used it as one. He believed it in the way that a man believes the things that organize his entire understanding of himself. The belief was genuine, which made it far more dangerous than cynical manipulation would have been. A man who knows he is performing can stop. A man who believes he is divine cannot. The initial expression of divine status was relatively contained. In Egypt, divine kingship was an ancient institution. The pharaoh was literally the son of Ra, a god walking among men. Alexander fit into that framework without friction because the framework already existed. The Egyptians had a place in their cosmology for what Alexander was claiming to be. In the Persian tradition, the great king was not a god, but was the earthly representative of Ahura Mazda, set apart from ordinary men by a sacred mandate. Alexander moved within that tradition too, adapting his claims to the theological vocabulary of each court. The flexibility was sophisticated. It was also, over time, unsustainable, because each audience heard a slightly different claim, and eventually Alexander began insisting on a version that none of them had agreed to. The turn came gradually and then decisively. By 330 BC, Alexander had begun to expect forms of deference that went beyond what Macedonian tradition permitted. He adopted Persian court dress, the upright tiara, the girdle, elements of the royal robe, not for Persian audiences alone, but in his own court, before his own officers. He began conducting audiences in a more formal, distanced manner, the spontaneous accessibility of the early campaign giving way to ceremony and protocol. His drinking became heavier, his temper more volatile, his response to challenge more extreme. The man who had eaten beside his soldiers and shared their cold camps was becoming something more remote, more exalted, more difficult to approach. The killing of Clitus is the moment the transformation became undeniable. Clitus the Black was the officer who had saved Alexander's life at the Granicus, striking down Spithridates as the satrap's blade was already falling toward Alexander. He was a senior commander, one of the men who had known Alexander since before the campaign, who remembered Philip's Macedonia and had served in it. At a banquet in Mariconda in 328 BC, drunk, he made the mistake of saying what many officers were privately thinking, that the campaign had gone too far, that Alexander was losing himself in Persian luxury and Persian pretension, that Philip's achievements were being diminished by a son who was rewriting his own history. Alexander struck him down on the spot, in the middle of the banquet. He then spent 3 days in his tent weeping, refusing food, stricken with a remorse that was genuine and useless. He had killed the man who saved his life because the man had told him an uncomfortable truth. The proskynesis demand followed in 327 BC, and it was the moment where the divine project collided directly with the political architecture of the empire. Proskynesis, the act of prostrating oneself fully before the king, face to the ground, was standard Persian court practice, a physical enactment of the absolute distance between the king and everyone else. For Persians, it carried no particular religious meaning. It was protocol. For Greeks and Macedonians, it was something reserved for the gods. To perform it before a living man was, in their understanding, a category error, a confusion of the human and the divine that bordered on blasphemy. When Alexander required it of his court, he was not just demanding a gesture. He was demanding that his officers publicly acknowledge a claim about his nature that most of them did not believe and found offensive. The philosopher Callisthenes, Aristotle's nephew, the campaign's official historian, refused. He argued in front of the court that the distinction between divine and human honor was meaningful and should be maintained. He was articulate, he was correct by the standards of Greek philosophical tradition, and he was destroyed. Alexander had him arrested on a charge of conspiracy, almost certainly fabricated. And he died in custody, by some accounts held under harsh conditions as the army marched on. The message sent by Callisthenes' fate was not subtle. Intellectual objection to Alexander's divine claims was now indistinguishable from treason. The space for honest counsel had been closed. The institutional consequence of that closure was severe. Every ruler needs people around him who will tell him when he is wrong. The mechanism does not have to be formal. It can be a trusted advisor, a senior general, a figure whose relationship with the king gives him license to speak plainly. Philip had had such people. The early Alexander had had Parmenion, who was frequently overruled but always heard. By 327 BC, Parmenion was dead, executed on Alexander's orders on suspicion of involvement in a conspiracy, the evidence thin and the real motivation almost certainly his son Philotas's actual involvement in a plot. With Parmenion gone and Callisthenes destroyed, the circle of people willing to tell Alexander what they actually thought had shrunk to almost nothing. What remained was a court of men who had learned that survival required agreement. A court of men who only agree is not a governing body. It is an echo chamber organized around the preferences of one person. The decisions that came out of it reflected Alexander's instincts, uncorrected by the friction of genuine counsel. When his instincts were good, and they were often good on military questions, the decisions were good. When they were bad, there was no mechanism to catch them before they became policy. The divine claims had severed the feedback loop that any functioning leadership structure requires. Alexander had made himself too sacred to advise, and the empire was governed accordingly. The succession problem crystallized around the divinity project in a way that was, in retrospect, almost mathematically inevitable. A god-king cannot name a successor in the ordinary way, because a successor implies a future in which the god-king is absent, a future in which his authority was provisional, time-limited, human. The Achaemenid kings had managed succession through an explicit designation of an heir during their own lifetime, backed by court ceremony and political preparation. Alexander could not do this without implicitly acknowledging that his divine reign had an end. He left it undone. The child Roxane was carrying when he died was his succession plan. An unborn child is not a succession plan. It is an absence dressed up as a hope. The demands for divine recognition also fractured the relationship between Alexander and his Greek and Macedonian subjects in ways that no amount of shared military success could repair. The officers who had crossed the Hellespont with him in 334 BC had done so as companions of a king, men who owed loyalty to a leader, not worship to a deity. As Alexander's divine claims escalated, the nature of their relationship to him changed in ways they found deeply uncomfortable. They were no longer comrades of an extraordinary man. They were subjects of a god. The Macedonian tradition had no framework for that relationship, no cultural vocabulary for it, no precedent. It felt, to men who remembered Philip's court, like a betrayal of what they were. The mutiny at the Hyphasis River in 326 BC, when the army simply refused to march further east, was not only exhaustion. It was also the accumulated weight of years of watching their king become something unrecognizable, Men who had followed Alexander through the Hindu Kush in winter, across the Gedrosian desert in summer, through 9 years of continuous campaign without a single defeat. These were not men who stopped because they were tired. They stopped because they no longer knew what they were marching for or who was asking them to march. The God at the center of the enterprise had become too remote, too volatile, too certain of his own exceptionalism to remain the figure they had followed out of Macedonia. They had followed Alexander. They were no longer sure the man in the Persian robes was him. The divinity project failed on its own terms as well. Alexander's intention in claiming divine status was to create a form of authority that transcended the ethnic and cultural divisions of his empire, a legitimacy that was not Macedonian or Persian or Greek, but universal, grounded in something above all of them. A god-king needed no ethnic constituency. His authority derived from a source that all peoples, regardless of tradition, could in principle acknowledge. It was an intelligent ambition. It failed because the divine claims were not actually universal. They were syncretic improvisations tailored to each audience separately, and the audiences knew it. The Egyptians received one version. The Persians received another. And the Macedonians received a demand that contradicted everything they believed about the relationship between men and gods. There was no coherent theology behind the project, and without a coherent theology, there could be no institutional structure built on top of it. What the divinity project left behind was not a sacred monarchy. It was a precedent. The idea that a ruler of sufficient greatness was entitled to demand a kind of deference that erased the distinction between human and divine authority. Alexander's successors would all grapple with this inheritance in different ways. Ptolemy in Egypt accepted pharaonic divinity because the Egyptian institutional framework already accommodated it. Seleucus in Asia cultivated divine associations more carefully, more institutionally, and without ever making them the center of his claim to legitimacy. None of them made the mistake Alexander had made, of allowing divine status to substitute for the institutional architecture that a real state requires. They had watched what happened when that mistake was made. They had watched the empire it produced dissolve in an afternoon. They built differently. In 329 BC, Alexander crossed the Hindu Kush. The range runs for 800 miles across what is now Afghanistan, its passes climbing above 15,000 feet, its winters capable of killing men and horses in hours. He crossed it in early spring, when the snow was still thick and the supply lines behind him were already stretched to the point of fiction. His army ate the pack animals on the way over. They arrived in Bactria, hungry, frostbitten, and ready to fight. Now, the crossing was an act of military will so extreme that it functioned almost as a statement, a declaration that the laws governing ordinary campaigns did not apply here, that the physical world itself would yield to Alexander's intention. It was also the moment the empire crossed a threshold from which there was no institutional return. Bactria and Sogdia, the territories that correspond roughly to modern Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan, were unlike anything Alexander had encountered before. The Achaemenid Empire had held them, technically, for 2 centuries, but holding them had always been a negotiation rather than a conquest. The terrain was not organized around cities and river valleys the way Mesopotamia and Egypt were. It was organized around fortified hilltops, tribal confederacies, seasonal grazing routes. Then, in a population that had spent generations learning how to make invasion expensive. There were no great urban centers to capture and hold, no administrative infrastructure to inherit, no priestly hierarchies to co-opt. There was only the land and the people in it, and their absolute refusal to be governed by someone they had not chosen. The campaign in Bactria and Sogdia lasted 3 years. 3 years to pacify a territory that the Macedonian army could cross militarily in weeks. Bessus, who had murdered Darius and proclaimed himself Artaxerxes V, was captured and executed in 329 BC, handed over by his own allies, which said something about the nature of loyalty in the eastern satrapies. His capture did not end the resistance. It transferred it. Spidamenes, a Sogdian nobleman of no particular prior prominence, emerged as the leader of a guerrilla campaign that was more sophisticated, more sustained, and more damaging than anything Alexander had faced from a conventional army. Spidamenes did not fight pitched battles. He raided, withdrew, reappeared elsewhere, wore the Macedonian columns down through attrition and distance and the impossibility of forcing an enemy to stand still. Alexander's response to the Bactrian Sogdian resistance was brutal in ways that went beyond the military pragmatism he usually maintained. Settlements suspected of sheltering rebels were destroyed. Populations were destroyed or forcibly dispersed. The city of Serapolis, one of 7 fortified towns in the Jaxartes Valley, was taken by assault after Alexander personally directed the undermining of its walls and led the entry through the breach, sustaining a serious wound in the process. The other 6 towns fell in a single day. The scale of violence was not incidental. It was the only tool available to an army fighting a population that declined to offer the kind of concentrated resistance that the Macedonian military machine was designed to destroy. The guerrilla war revealed something the set-piece battles had concealed. Alexander's way of war was effective against armies, not against peoples. At Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela, the objective was identifiable: a Persian army in a specific place with a command structure that could be broken by eliminating its leadership and routing its formations. In Bactria and Sogdia, there was no such objective. The resistance was distributed, leaderless in the conventional sense, embedded in the population itself. Now, every village that sheltered a raiding party was a military problem with no clean military solution. Alexander could destroy the village, which generated more resentment and more recruits for the resistance. He could garrison it, which dispersed his forces and exposed the garrisons to the same raiding. He could negotiate, which he did eventually, marrying Roxane partly as a political gesture toward Bactrian reconciliation, but negotiation required concessions that could be read as weakness. None of the options was good. He chose all of them at different times. The marriage to Roxane in 327 BC was Alexander's most explicit acknowledgement that military force alone could not pacify the eastern territories. Roxane was the daughter of a Bactrian baron named Oxyartes, whose mountain fortress Alexander had taken after a siege of considerable difficulty. The marriage transformed a defeated enemy into a father-in-law, which was a gesture toward the kind of political integration that could, over time, produce genuine stability. It also horrified Alexander's Macedonian officers, who regarded marriage to a barbarian noblewoman as a betrayal of the cultural hierarchy the campaign was supposed to uphold. The marriage was real. Alexander appears to have felt genuine attachment to Roxane, but it was also an improvisation, a local solution to a local problem, not a model he extended systematically to the other eastern territories. India was the choice that made the overextension complete and irreversible. By 327 BC, the eastern satrapies were nominally pacified. Spidamenes had been killed by his own allies. The major fortresses were garrisoned. The new city of Alexandria on the Oxus had been founded. A ruler focused on consolidation would have stopped here, spent years integrating Bactria and Sogdia into something functional, and built the administrative infrastructure that 3 years of brutal campaigning had made necessary. Alexander turned east instead. The Indus Valley, the subcontinent beyond, the world's edge that Aristotle had described in the lessons of his childhood. These were not strategic objectives. They were the horizon, moving ahead of him as it always had. The Indian campaign produced some of Alexander's most extraordinary military achievements and some of his most consequential strategic miscalculations. The Battle of the Hydaspes River in 326 BC fought against the Indian king Porus, who commanded war elephants in numbers Alexander had not faced before. required a tactical adaptation that demonstrated once again the quality of Alexander's military mind. He crossed the river in darkness and rain, split his force to confuse Porus about where the main attack would come, and defeated a force that had every geographic and material advantage. Porus fought with such courage that Alexander kept him as a client king, restored his territory, and extended it. It was the kind of magnanimous settlement that, applied systematically, might have built something durable. It was applied to Porus and essentially nowhere else. The army that crossed the Hydaspes was not the army that had crossed the Hellespont 11 years earlier. The men were older, the equipment was worn, the distances from home had become so vast that Macedonia itself felt like a story told by someone else. Many of the original Macedonian veterans had been replaced by local recruits from the conquered territories, Persians, Bactrians, Sogdians, whose loyalty was to Alexander personally, calibrated by the experience of watching what happened to people who opposed him, not by the long institutional culture of the Macedonian army. The force was still effective. It was also increasingly a reflection of the empire's own fragility, diverse, improvised, held together by one man's presence. At the Hyphasis River in 326 BC, the army stopped. The officers gathered, and Conus, one of Alexander's most experienced commanders, a man who had never previously refused anything, spoke for the rest. They had followed him into the Hindu Kush and through 3 years of guerrilla war and across the Punjab. They had wives and children they had not seen in a decade. They were tired, not in the ordinary sense, but in the bone-deep way that accumulates when a man has been at the edge of death for long enough that he can no longer remember what ordinary life felt like. And beyond the Hyphasis, according to the reports reaching the Macedonian camp, lay the Ganges Valley and armies larger than anything they had yet faced. Conus said what all of them felt. It was enough. Alexander should turn back. Alexander did not take it well. He spent 3 days in his tent, hoping the army would change its mind. It did not. He performed omens. The sacrificial signs, conveniently, did not favor crossing. He announced that he was turning back, deframing it as a concession to the gods rather than to his men. He built 12 enormous altars on the riverbank, monuments to the furthest point of the march, and then ordered the return. Conus died of illness shortly afterward, naturally, the sources say, though the timing was noted. Alexander wept at his funeral with a grief that may have been genuine and was certainly convenient. The man who had told him the truth was gone, and the truth could be buried with him. The return route through the Gedrosian desert was the campaign's greatest self-inflicted catastrophe. Alexander chose it partly for logistical reasons. He wanted to support a naval expedition under Nearchus sailing the coast, and partly, it seems, because he had heard that Semiramis and Cyrus the Great had both tried to cross the Gedrosian, and both had failed. He would succeed where they had not. The desert killed perhaps a quarter of his army. The heat was absolute, the water sources days apart, the terrain without shade or shelter. Men and pack animals died of thirst within sight of each other, unable to help. Those who had been following the campaign train were lost to flash floods that swept through without warning in the night. The survivors emerged onto the coast of Persia, gaunt and diminished in ways that the sources struggle to adequately describe. The Gedrosian March was not a military mistake in the conventional sense. It was a statement of the same logic that had driven the entire Eastern campaign, that limits were things that applied to lesser men, that the world's resistance was a problem of will rather than of physics. Alexander had made that logic work, repeatedly, across 11 years. In the Gedrosian desert, it killed 20,000 people and accomplished nothing that an alternate coastal route would not have accomplished more safely. The empire it returned to was already showing the fractures that years of absence and improvised governance had produced. The satraps he had appointed were behaving as men behave when they believe the authority above them has become too distant to be real. The Eastern campaigns, Bactria, Sogdia, India, The Gedrosian return had taken 4 years and had extended the empire's territorial reach to the point where it was, in any practical administrative sense, ungovernable as a single unit. The distances from the western satrapies to the eastern ones were so vast that a message from Alexander in India took months to reach Babylon. A crisis in Bactria could develop, yet mature and resolve itself in whatever direction, before Alexander in the Punjab had received word that it had begun. The empire's size was not an achievement. It was the mechanism of its own failure, the proof that a dominion held together only by one man's presence could not survive the distances that one man's ambition had imposed on it. What Alexander left behind in the east was a series of garrisons, a scattering of Alexandrias, a network of roads built for military movement rather than commercial integration, and a population whose experience of Macedonian rule had been primarily the experience of being conquered. The Bactrians and Sogdians would revolt within months of Alexander's death. The Indian territories were abandoned almost immediately. Chandragupta Maurya, who may have met Alexander during the campaign, he swept through the eastern satrapies within 2 years and built in the same territory a genuinely institutional empire that would last for generations. He did what Alexander had not. He governed. The edge of the world, it turned out, was not a geographic limit. It was an institutional one. Alexander could reach the hyphasis. He could not administer it. He could conquer Bactria 3 times over, and did effectively conquer it 3 times because each pacification decayed the moment the army moved on. The land he crossed left almost no permanent Macedonian mark. The cities he founded mostly did not survive his successor's wars. The peoples he defeated returned, in one form or another, to governing themselves within a generation. Known the furthest east of Alexander's empire was also the most honest expression of what the empire actually was. Territory that had been passed through, not territory that had been made. In the last years of the campaign, while Alexander was fighting in Bactria and India, the western provinces were governed by men he had appointed and then largely forgotten. The appointments had been made quickly, on campaign, by a commander whose attention was always fixed on what lay ahead rather than what lay behind. The men chosen ranged from competent to catastrophically unsuitable, and the system for distinguishing between them, for reviewing their conduct, correcting their abuses, replacing the failures before the damage became irreversible, did not exist. What existed was Alexander's reputation, transmitted at great distance, and the knowledge that he occasionally killed governors who had gone too far. It was not enough. Harpalus was the most spectacular failure and the most revealing. He had been a childhood friend of Alexander's, one of the inner circle exiled by Philip for supporting Alexander during a succession dispute, recalled when Alexander became king and given a position of trust. He was appointed treasurer, keeper of the imperial finances, the man responsible for the accumulated wealth of the Achaemenid treasuries that Alexander had been depositing in Ecbatana and other strongholds. It was the single most important administrative appointment in the empire. Harpalus was given it because Alexander trusted him, not because there was any institutional mechanism for evaluating whether he was suited to it. Harpalus was not suited to it. He had fled once already in the early campaign, during a moment of apparent crisis, and had been forgiven and reinstated. In Alexander's absence, he treated the imperial treasury as a personal fund. He imported Athenian courtesans to Babylon at enormous expense, held banquets of legendary extravagance, and conducted himself with the kind of sovereign indulgence that was available to a man who controlled the empire's money and faced no meaningful oversight. When reports of his conduct reached Alexander in India, Harpalus did not wait for the response. He fled westward with 6,000 mercenaries and 5,000 talents of silver, a sum that would have funded a substantial army, and eventually reached Athens, where he attempted to use the money to foment a Greek revolt against Macedonian rule. He was murdered before he could accomplish much, But the silver he had stolen was never fully recovered. Harpalus was extreme, but he was not unique. Across the western satrapies, the years of Alexander's eastern campaigns had produced a quiet proliferation of the same basic behavior. Governors enriching themselves, abusing subject populations, settling private scores, building personal military forces that had no sanction from the center. The pattern was not surprising. It was the predictable consequence of appointing men to positions of autonomous authority, removing meaningful oversight, and then staying absent for years. What was surprising was how long it took Alexander to address it, and how he addressed it when he finally did. When Alexander returned from the Gedrosian desert in 325 BC and began moving through the western satrapies, what he found was an empire that had been quietly unraveling in his absence. Satraps had raised private armies, temple treasuries had been looted, subject populations had been taxed beyond what any legal framework, had one existed, would have permitted. Alexander's response was a purge. Over the following months, he executed or removed a significant number of sitting governors across Media, Persia, Susiana, and other provinces. The executions were swift, the charges varied, the evidence in many cases thin. What the purge accomplished was a demonstration that Alexander was back and paying attention. What it did not accomplish was any structural change in the conditions that had produced the abuses. The case of Cleomenes in Egypt is worth returning to here because it illustrates the pattern with particular clarity. Cleomenes had been appointed financial overseer of Egypt in 331 BC. A position that gave him authority over the province's considerable revenues without giving him formal satrapal power. Over the following years, in Alexander's absence, he had effectively become the de facto ruler of Egypt, combining financial control with the authority vacuum left by Alexander's departure. He manipulated grain prices during famines, extracting maximum profit from Egyptian and foreign buyers alike. He accepted bribes from temple priests to overlook regulations. He consolidated power in ways that Alexander had not sanctioned and that no institutional check prevented. Alexander received complaints, acknowledged them in letters, and continued to use Cleomenes because he was useful. The complaints were true, the utility outweighed them. Cleomenes continued, "The Persian noble Oryxines provides a different facet of the same problem. He had governed Persia proper in Alexander's absence, maintaining order and presenting himself when Alexander returned as a loyal and capable administrator. He was then accused by Bagoas, Alexander's Persian favorite, whose influence over the king had become a matter of court whisper and officer resentment, of plundering tombs and executing Persians without cause. Alexander had him executed. Whether Oryxines was guilty of the specific charges is unclear. What is clear is that the evidence came from Bagoas, whose personal motives were obvious, and that Alexander accepted it without the kind of formal inquiry that a functioning legal system would have required. The governor of Persia was executed on the testimony of a court intimate. The empire's legal infrastructure was this: whatever Alexander believed on any given day, in whatever emotional state the day had produced. Pusestus was the exception, the appointment that worked and that reveals by contrast how much the others failed. He was a Macedonian officer who had saved Alexander's life during the assault on the Mali city in India, standing over the fallen king with his own body while the Macedonian assault recovered its footing. Alexander appointed him satrap of Persia proper and gave him, uniquely, explicit encouragement to adopt Persian dress, learn the Persian language, or to integrate himself into Persian aristocratic culture. Pusestas did all of this with genuine commitment. He became, by the time of Alexander's death, the most respected Macedonian figure in the Persian heartland, trusted by both communities, capable of navigating between them. He held Persia through the chaos of the succession wars with a stability that no other satrapy matched. He was the proof of concept for an approach Alexander never systematized. The military appointments in the eastern satrapies were a separate category of problem. Alexander had garrisoned Bactria, Sogdia, and the Indian borderlands with Macedonian and Greek veterans, men who had reached the furthest point of the campaign and been settled there, some voluntarily, many not. These garrisons were far from home, and in territories whose populations had resisted Macedonian presence with sustained violence, governed by officers whose authority derived from a commander who was now marching away. The moment news arrived of Alexander's death, most of these garrisons began moving west. They were not abandoning their posts out of cowardice. They were responding rationally to the dissolution of the authority structure that had placed them there. The eastern settlements collapsed almost immediately because they had been planted in soil that had never been prepared for them. Antipater, governing Macedonia and Greece in Alexander's name throughout the entire campaign, deserves particular attention, because his situation illustrates the structural contradiction at the heart of Alexander's administrative system more clearly than anyone else's. And Antipater was a veteran of Philip's court, a capable general and administrator, a man who had governed Macedonia through more than a decade of Alexander's absence with considerable competence. He had suppressed Aggis's Spartan revolt in 331 BC, maintained the loyalty of the Greek city-states through a combination of diplomacy and force, and kept the Macedonian home base functional while Alexander stripped it of men and resources. He was, by any reasonable measure, indispensable. Alexander did not treat him as indispensable. He treated him as a subordinate whose growing power was a threat. By 324 BC, Alexander was receiving reports, partly from his mother Olympias, whose relationship with Antipater had curdled into open hostility, that Antipater was conducting himself too independently, accumulating too much authority, yet behaving less like a governor and more like a king. Alexander summoned him to Babylon to explain himself. Antipater sent his son Cassander instead, and began preparing for the possibility that Alexander's summons was a prelude to his execution. The man who had kept Macedonia stable for 11 years was, at the end of the campaign, in a relationship with his king that had deteriorated to mutual suspicion and the preparation for potential violence. This was what Alexander's administrative system produced at the top: loyalty converted, over time, into calculation. The broader officer class was navigating the same deterioration, and the men who had been with Alexander since the beginning, who remembered crossing the Hellespont in 334 BC with 30 days of supplies and a king who slept beside them, had spent 11 years watching the campaign transform into something they no longer entirely recognized. The casualty list among the senior officers was long: Parmenion executed, Philotas executed, Clytus killed in a drunken rage, Callisthenes destroyed in custody. The pattern visible in that list was not the elimination of traitors. It was the elimination of men who had told Alexander things he did not want to hear, or who had accumulated enough independent reputation to feel like a potential rival, or who had simply been present when Alexander's temper overwhelmed his judgment. Survival in Alexander's inner circle required, above all, the suppression of honesty. It's what this produced by 324 BC was a command structure populated by men who had learned to manage Alexander rather than advise him. They knew his moods, his triggers, his vanities, and his needs, and they arranged their counsel accordingly. They told him what would be received well and withheld what would not. They supported his plans in council and dissented, if at all, in private and oblique ways that preserved deniability. This was not corruption in the ordinary sense. It was rational adaptation to an environment in which honest counsel had become dangerous. The men around Alexander were not bad men. They were men who had concluded correctly that being a good counselor in Alexander's court was incompatible with remaining alive. The appointments Alexander made in the final year of his life showed the consequences. In returning from India, reorganizing the empire's administration, he was working with a severely degraded information environment: governors who reported selectively, officers who agreed reflexively, a court that had learned not to volunteer unwelcome news. The purge he conducted was aimed at the symptoms rather than the cause, removing individual bad actors without changing the conditions that produced them. The replacements he made were no better supervised than the men they replaced, no more embedded in a functional oversight system, no more likely to remain loyal when the army was 4,000 miles away and the alternative to loyalty was simply taking what was available. He was repairing a structure that had no foundation, patching a building whose walls had no connection to the ground. The men Alexander trusted, and the men he should have trusted and did not, and the men he should not have trusted and did, together constitute the most damning evidence against the empire's administrative coherence. Not because the individuals were uniformly bad, but because the system had no way of knowing which ones were good. There was no review process, no standardized reporting, no inspectorate, no legal framework that would have made embezzlement difficult, no succession of authority that would have made personal loyalty to Alexander rational beyond his own lifetime. The empire's personnel were its administration, and its personnel were chosen by instinct, rewarded by favoritism, corrected by occasional violent example, and left in between to do whatever the distance from Alexander made possible. What the distance made possible, now in most cases, was everything. Alexander entered Babylon in the spring of 323 BC for the second time, and the city received him with the ambivalence of a place that had learned to read omens carefully. The Chaldean priests, Babylon's ancient astronomical and religious establishment, men whose records stretched back centuries and whose authority derived from a relationship with the divine that predated Alexander's birth by 1,000 years, sent word that he should not enter the city from the west. The configuration of the heavens was unfavorable. The omens were bad. Alexander's Greek advisors dismissed the warning as superstition or political maneuvering. Alexander entered from the east instead, which required a detour through marshland that slowed the army and accomplished nothing except the technical satisfaction of a prophecy. He was 32 years old, the ruler of the known world, and he was routing his army through a swamp to appease an astrological warning he claimed not to believe. Babylon, in 323 BC, was the closest thing the empire had to a capital, though calling it a capital overstates the empire's institutional coherence. It was where Alexander happened to be, which was the only definition of the imperial center that the empire's structure permitted. The city itself was extraordinary. The Euphrates running through it, the great ziggurat of Marduk rising above the flat Mesopotamian plain, the hanging gardens whose existence later generations would debate. The ancient market districts where goods from India and Egypt and the Greek world moved through hands that had been trading here for 3,000 years. Alexander had plans for it. Now, he always had plans. The plans were vast, and their vastness was itself a kind of confession. Alexander in Babylon in 323 BC was planning the circumnavigation of Arabia, a naval expedition that would chart the Arabian Peninsula and potentially open a sea route connecting the Persian Gulf to Egypt. He was planning campaigns in the western Mediterranean, against Carthage, against the Italian Peninsula, against the peoples of North Africa. He was planning the construction of a fleet of 1,000 warships to be built in Phoenicia and the Persian Gulf simultaneously. He was planning a road system along the North African coast, a network of cities to anchor it, a temple to Athena at Ilium so large it would be visible from the sea. He had been back from India for less than 2 years, and he was planning the conquest of the Western world. And the plans were not delusion. They were the logical continuation of a mind that had never found a reason to stop. Every previous plan had been realized. The invasion of Persia, the conquest of Egypt, the fall of the Achaemenid throne, the march to the edge of India. Why would Arabia be different? Why would the Western Mediterranean resist what the Eastern world had not? The plans were also, in their accumulation, a precise map of everything Alexander was not doing. He was not consolidating the Eastern satrapies that were already revolting. He was not building the legal infrastructure that the empire's diverse populations required. He was not resolving the succession question that his officers raised in various indirect ways with increasing frequency. He was planning the next campaign, because the next campaign was the only problem he knew how to solve. The decree of the exiles, issued at the Olympic Games of 324 BC, belongs in the picture of those final months because it illustrates the administrative chaos that the empire's lack of institutional structure had generated. Alexander ordered that all Greek city-states readmit their political exiles, tens of thousands of men who had been expelled over decades of political conflict, and who were now, by royal decree, to be returned to cities that had reorganized themselves entirely around their absence. The decree was received at Olympia by an enormous crowd, and generated by the accounts that survive, something between astonishment and panic. It was legally incoherent. Alexander had no authority over the internal constitutions of the Greek city-states, now which were theoretically autonomous members of the League of Corinth. It created immediate practical crises in cities that had redistributed the exiles' property and had no means of restoring it. It was, above all, a solution imposed from outside on problems that required local negotiation and institutional process to resolve. It was governance by decree, applied to situations that decrees could not fix. The Opus Mutiny in 324 BC was the Western Army's version of the hyphasis, the moment when the accumulated grievances of the campaign found a collective voice. Alexander had announced plans to discharge the Macedonian veterans who were no longer fit for service and send them home with generous settlements. The veterans heard it differently. They heard a king who had gone so thoroughly native, Persian robes, Persian ceremony, Persian favorites, that he no longer needed them, who was replacing his Macedonian army with Persian troops trained in Macedonian style, who had forgotten what he was and where he had come from. They shouted at him. They told him to go fight his wars with his father Zeus Ammon. Alexander had the ringleaders arrested and executed immediately, then addressed the remaining army in a speech of extraordinary emotional force, cataloging everything Macedonia had been given through Philip and everything the world had become through their shared campaign. He then withdrew to his quarters and refused to see anyone for 2 days. The army capitulated, as it always did. The Macedonians came to his tent, weeping, asking forgiveness. Alexander came out and wept with them. There was a reconciliation banquet at which Alexander prayed, and for the first time explicitly, for harmony between Macedonians and Persians, a partnership of governance, a shared empire. It was the most institutionally ambitious statement he had ever made about what the empire could be. It was made in the context of a mutiny he had just suppressed through emotional theater and the execution of dissidents. The prayer was genuine. The conditions for realizing it did not exist, had never been built, and could not be built by prayer alone. Hephaestion died in Ecbatana in the autumn of 324 BC of a fever that developed rapidly during a period of heavy drinking. He was Alexander's closest companion, the one figure in the inner circle who had known Alexander in the way that only someone present at the formation of a person can know them. Before the legend, before the divine claims, before the campaign had turned Alexander into something that even Alexander could not entirely recognize. His death undid Alexander in ways that the campaign's violence had not. Alexander had the physician who had been attending Hephaestion publicly executed. He ordered a period of mourning across the empire, suppressed festivals, silenced music. He applied to the oracle at Siwa to have Hephaestion declared a god. He planned a funeral monument so enormous, 10,000 talents, some sources say, that it would have been the most expensive single structure in the ancient world. He spent weeks unable to function in any recognizable administrative sense. The grief was real. It was also the grief of a man who had already lost over the preceding years, and almost everyone who had known him before the legend and who had remained willing to speak to him honestly. Clitus was dead. Parmenion was dead. Callisthenes was dead. Conus was dead. The men who remained were survivors of a selective pressure that favored agreement over honesty, flattery over counsel, loyalty performed over loyalty felt. Hephaestion's death removed the last figure in Alexander's life who existed outside the dynamic of fear and performance that the court had become. What replaced him was absence, a silence at the center of Alexander's inner world that the plans for Arabia and the Western Mediterranean could not fill. In the winter of 324 to 323 BC, Alexander conducted a campaign against the Kasaans, a tribal people in the Zagros Mountains who had maintained their independence through the same basic strategy the Bactrians and Sogdians had used: terrain, dispersal, refusal to offer the kind of fixed resistance that the Macedonian army could destroy efficiently. The campaign lasted 40 days and was described by the sources as a punitive expedition, a distraction, a way of filling the weeks of mourning for Hephaestion with the only activity that reliably organized Alexander's grief into something productive. It was also an exhibition of the empire's fundamental administrative problem in miniature: a military force capable of passing through any territory and incapable of leaving anything durable behind it. If the question of what would happen to the empire after Alexander's death was present in Babylon in 323 BC in the way that a structural fault is present in a building, visible to anyone who looked for it, ignored by everyone who preferred not to. Alexander's officers knew he had no designated heir. They knew Roxane's child, if it survived and was male, would be an infant in a world of competing generals. They knew the empire's administration was a patchwork of improvised arrangements that depended on Alexander's continued intervention to remain functional. They did not raise these matters directly, because raising them directly would have been read as anticipating Alexander's death, which was close enough to wishing for it to be dangerous. The silence around the succession was not ignorance. It was the rational behavior of men who had watched what happened to people who said uncomfortable things. Alexander's drinking in Babylon in the spring of 323 BC was conspicuous even by the standards of a court where drinking was a form of political theater. The symposia, formal drinking parties that served as the primary social institution of the Macedonian nobility, had always been central to Alexander's court life. In Babylon, in those final months, they became something more consuming. Whether the drinking was a response to Hephaestion's death, or to the accumulated weight of 11 years of campaign, or to something physical that was already developing in Alexander's body, the sources cannot say with certainty. What they record is the pattern: long nights, enormous quantities of wine, the kind of sleep that followed them, and then the waking to plans and preparations, and the ordinary business of a court that was still, formally, the center of the world's largest empire. In June of 323 BC, after a banquet at the house of a Macedonian officer named Medius, Alexander developed a fever. The fever did not break. For 10 days it worsened, in the way that fevers worsen when the body has no reserve left to fight with. And Alexander's body, after 11 years of wounds and deserts and mountain crossings in the Gedrosian catastrophe, had very little reserve. His officers and soldiers came to see him, filing through his chambers in a long, silent procession, and he acknowledged them, unable by then to speak, with his eyes and a movement of his hand. He knew what they were doing. They were saying goodbye. When his senior officers gathered around his bed and asked him to whom he left the empire, the answer he gave, if he gave one, the sources disagree on whether he was capable of speech by then, was either to the strongest or silence. Both amount to the same thing. There was no name. There was no institution. There was no legal framework, no designated successor, no mechanism for collective governance, no fallback position that the empire could default to in the absence of a clear heir. There was a dying man in a palace in Babylon, and around him a circle of very capable, very ambitious men who were already, behind their grief, beginning to calculate. The empire's entire governing logic had just moved from the living to the dead, and there was nowhere for it to go. He died on the 10th or 11th of June, 323 BC. He was 32 years old. The cause, debated ever since, attributed variously to typhoid fever complicated by his accumulated wounds, to excessive alcohol consumption, destroying a liver already weakened by years of hard living, to poison administered by one faction or another in the court, does not finally matter to the institutional question. The institutional question is not what killed Alexander. It is what he left behind when he died. The answer, after 11 years and 3 continents and the largest empire the world had ever seen, was an army without a commander, a court without a constitution, a treasury without a fiscal system, and a set of territories whose only organizing principle had just stopped breathing. That was the confession Babylon extracted. Not from Alexander's lips, but from the structure of everything he had built. Alexander's body was still warm when the empire began to come apart. The senior officers gathered in Babylon within hours of his death and immediately faced the question that Alexander had spent 11 years refusing to answer: who governs now and by what authority? There was no legal framework to consult, no designated successor to acclaim, no institutional procedure for transferring power. There was Roxane, pregnant, whose child might be male or might not, and who in either case would be an infant in a room full of generals. There was Aridaeus, Alexander's half-brother, intellectually disabled, present in the camp, and technically of royal blood. There was Perdiccas, who held Alexander's signet ring, handed to him, some said, and in the king's final moments, and who interpreted that gesture as a mandate. And there were the rest: Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antigonus, Lysimachus, Cassander, Craterus. Men who had spent 11 years subordinating their own ambitions to Alexander's, and who now found those ambitions suddenly, catastrophically unhoused. The first settlement, reached at Babylon within days of Alexander's death, was a compromise that satisfied no one and was designed to fail. Aridaeus was proclaimed king as Philip III, to be joined as co-ruler by Roxane's child if it proved to be a son, which it was, born 3 months later and named Alexander IV. Perdiccas was named regent. The senior generals received satrapal assignments that translated in practice into personal kingdoms. Ptolemy took Egypt, Antigonus took Phrygia and the surrounding regions of Asia Minor, Lysimachus took Thrace, Craterus received nominal authority over Macedonia and Greece. The settlement looked like governance. It was a starting position for a war. The wars of the successors, the Diadochi, as history calls them, the men who came after, lasted for 40 years and consumed most of the empire's resources, most of its military capacity, and most of the generation of leaders who had known Alexander personally. By 281 BC, when the last of the original Diadochi died at the Battle of Corupedium, the empire had resolved itself into 3 successor kingdoms: the Ptolemaic in Egypt, the Seleucid across the Asian heartland, and the Antigonid in Macedonia and Greece. Each had been built through warfare, diplomacy, marriage, assassination, and the patient accumulation of whatever institutional infrastructure the original empire had lacked. Each was, in the end, more durable than anything Alexander had built. The speed and totality of the fragmentation is itself the argument. Not that Alexander's successors were exceptionally treacherous, but that the structure he had left them was exceptionally hollow. Ptolemy moved first and most intelligently. Within months of Alexander's death, he intercepted the funeral cortege carrying Alexander's body toward Macedonia and redirected it to Egypt, first to Memphis, eventually to Alexandria, where it was installed in a magnificent tomb that became one of the wonders of the ancient world. The body of Alexander was not, for Ptolemy, primarily a sentimental object. Thus, it was a political asset, the most powerful source of legitimacy available in a world where everyone was scrambling for legitimacy, and Ptolemy had just secured exclusive custody of it. It was exactly the kind of institutional thinking Alexander himself had never applied to his own succession. Ptolemy understood, in a way Alexander had not, that authority required anchoring in something external to the man who held it. What Ptolemy built in Egypt over the following 4 decades was the thing Alexander's Egyptian arrangements had sketched and never completed. He retained the administrative separation of civil and military authority that Alexander had introduced, deepened it, and gave it legal definition. He built a court bureaucracy with defined roles and reporting structures. He established a fiscal system that taxed Egypt's agricultural surplus with considerable efficiency and channeled the revenue into state institutions rather than into campaign expenses. He founded the library and the Museum, the greatest research institution of the ancient world, not as an act of cultural vanity, but as a deliberate project of intellectual consolidation, drawing the best minds of the Greek world to Alexandria and anchoring them there with salaries and resources. The Ptolemaic kingdom lasted nearly 3 centuries, until Cleopatra VII lost it to Rome in 30 BC. What Alexander had sketched in Egypt in a few winter weeks, Ptolemy spent a lifetime building into something that endured. Seleucus built differently, across a harder terrain. The territories he eventually consolidated, stretching from Syria through Mesopotamia into Persia and eastward through much of the old Achaemenid heartland, were the ones Alexander had governed most inadequately, the regions where the satrapal appointments had been most improvised and the institutional neglect most complete. Seleucus began with almost nothing. He had been given Babylonia in the first partition, lost it to Antigonus, and retaken it through a campaign that lasted years. What he built on regaining it was a kingdom organized around cities, dozens of new foundations, many of them named Antioch or Seleucia, planted along trade routes and river crossings, and designed from the beginning as administrative centers rather than military garrisons. The Seleucid cities had courts and markets and temples and legal institutions. They were intended to last. Seleucus also did something Alexander had never done in the East. He negotiated. In 305 BC, facing Chandragupta Maurya's consolidating empire in the Indus Valley, Seleucus conducted a war and then a peace, ceding the eastern satrapies that Alexander had conquered and immediately lost in exchange for 500 war elephants and a diplomatic relationship that gave both empires a stable eastern frontier. It was a territorial retreat and a political achievement simultaneously. Alexander would not have made it. He was constitutionally incapable of trading land for stability, of accepting a smaller empire in exchange for a more governable one. Seleucus made the trade and built a kingdom that lasted 2.5 centuries. The contrast between how Alexander appointed governors and how his successors built administrations is the clearest measure of what the original empire had lacked. Alexander appointed men and moved on. His successors built systems. Ptolemy's Egypt had a chancellor, a finance minister, a chief justice, a commander of the royal guard, defined roles with defined authorities and defined relationships to the throne. The Seleucid administration developed a tiered system of local governance with city councils and regional governors and royal overseers whose functions were distinct and whose interactions were regulated. These were not sophisticated by the standards of later bureaucratic states. By the standards of Alexander's empire, that they were transformative. The difference between a dominion that functioned only in the presence of its ruler and one that could function in his absence. The succession mechanisms the Diadochi developed tell the same story. Ptolemy I designated his son Ptolemy II as co-ruler during his own lifetime in 285 BC and trained him in the administration of the kingdom for years before abdicating. The transition was orderly. The kingdom continued. Seleucus named his son Antiochus as co-ruler and governor of the eastern territories, giving him real authority and real experience before the full transfer of power. The Antigonid succession was messier, more violent, more reflective of the Macedonian tradition of competing claims. But even there, In the principle that succession required preparation and designation was understood and imperfectly applied. None of them left the question unanswered. None of them said, "to the strongest," and left the rest to chance. The speed with which the eastern territories were abandoned after Alexander's death is a precise measure of how shallow his presence there had been. The Greek and Macedonian settlers in Bactria and Sogdia, the garrisons in the Indian borderlands, the administrators in the furthest eastern satrapies, all of them began moving west within months. They were not fleeing an enemy. They were responding to the collapse of the authority structure that had placed them there, following the only logic available: go home or go to wherever the next power center was forming. Chandragupta Maurya moved into the eastern satrapies almost immediately and encountered no meaningful resistance. The Macedonian presence in India, which had cost 3 years of brutal campaigning to establish, vanished in months. It left behind almost no institutional mark, no law code, no administrative tradition, no urban infrastructure that persisted beyond a generation. It left behind, in some regions, the memory of Alexander, which is a different kind of legacy entirely. Antigonus, the one-eyed, deserves particular attention because he was the diadochi who came closest to reassembling the empire as a single unit, and his failure to do so is illuminating. Antigonus was the most militarily aggressive of the successors, just the one who most resembled Alexander in his appetite for territorial expansion and his impatience with the slower work of institutional consolidation. He came close, at several points in the 300s and 310s BC, to achieving a dominant position across the old empire's territories. He was stopped each time by a coalition of the other diadochi, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Lysimachus, Cassander, who understood that a single dominant power would consume them all, and who cooperated long enough to prevent it. Antigonus died at Ipsus in 301 BC at the age of 80, still fighting for the empire that had dissolved before he could reassemble it. His failure confirmed what the fragmentation had already demonstrated. The empire as Alexander had built it could not be reconstituted, because the thing that had held it together, one man's personal authority, was not transferable. The proclamation of the diadochi as kings in 306 and 305 BC, when Antigonus took the title first, followed immediately by Ptolemy, Seleucus, Cassander, and Lysimachus, was the formal acknowledgement of what had been true since Alexander died. There was no empire. There were kingdoms. Each king built his kingdom's legitimacy differently. Ptolemy, through the custody of Alexander's body and the cultivation of Egyptian religious tradition. Seleucus, through the founding of cities and the patronage of local cults. The Antigonids, through the Macedonian military tradition and the claim to Philip's inheritance. What none of them did, what all of them conspicuously avoided, was base their legitimacy primarily on their personal relationship to Alexander. They referenced him, used his image, built on his conquests. They did not try to be him because they had watched closely enough to understand that being Alexander was a project with one possible outcome. The legal innovations of the successor kingdoms reflect the same lesson absorbed from the same source. Ptolemaic Egypt developed one of the most sophisticated legal systems of the ancient world, a dual system that operated Greek law for the Greek and Macedonian population and Egyptian law for the native population, with mechanisms for resolving disputes between the two communities. It was administratively complex and imperfect, but it was an attempt to do something Alexander had never attempted: create a legal framework that acknowledged the empire's cultural diversity rather than governing over it by personal decree. The Seleucid kingdom similarly developed mechanisms for incorporating local legal traditions, Babylonian, Persian, Aramaic, into an administrative system that could function across an enormous cultural range. These were the answers to problems Alexander had identified and never solved. The Library of Alexandria, founded under Ptolemy I and expanded dramatically under Ptolemy II, is perhaps the most emblematic product of the successor era, and the one that most clearly illuminates what Alexander's empire had been missing. Yet the library's project was explicit: to collect every book written in every language and make it available to scholars working in Alexandria. It was an institutional expression of the idea that knowledge was a resource to be accumulated, organized, and made productive, that an empire's intellectual life was as important as its military capacity. Ptolemy spent enormous sums acquiring texts, hiring scholars, funding research across mathematics, astronomy, medicine, literature, and philosophy. The institution he built lasted in various forms for centuries. Alexander had Aristotle's nephew Callisthenes with him on campaign and had him killed. The comparison is not flattering. By 280 BC, 40 years after Alexander's death, the world he had conquered had been reorganized into something more durable than what he had built, yet more institutionally coherent, more capable of surviving the deaths of its founders. The Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged from the Diadochi Wars were not what Alexander had intended. They were smaller, more culturally hybrid, more administratively sophisticated, more honestly governed by law and institution rather than by one man's unchecked will. They were, in the most precise sense, the corrections to Alexander's errors, the structures built in the spaces he had left empty, the institutions created to fill the gaps his speed had opened. The men who built them had been his generals. They had watched him for years, absorbed everything he did and everything he refused to do. And then, when the space finally opened, they built what he had not. The successors completed the project the Conqueror had abandoned. They just had the patience and the necessity to do it differently. The fragmentation of Alexander's empire was not a tragedy imposed from outside. It was the empire resolving itself into its natural state, the state it had always been trending toward, beneath the surface of Alexander's personal authority. The Diadochi did not break something that was working. They inherited something that had never been built to last and spent 40 years turning it into something that could. The speed of the collapse: within a year, the empire was effectively divided. Within a generation, it was unrecognizable, was not a measure of their failure. It was a measure of his. What the Diadochi era ultimately reveals is that the ingredients Alexander had assembled, the wealth, the territory, the cultural connections, the military tradition, yes, the geographic reach, were sufficient to sustain durable states. They simply required the one thing Alexander had never provided: institutions. The successor kingdoms took the same raw material and made it last for centuries in some cases. Ptolemaic Egypt endured until 30 BC. The Seleucid kingdom, in various reduced forms, lasted until 63 BC. The Antigonid dynasty held Macedonia until Rome absorbed it in 168 BC. 3 centuries of institutional continuity built on the ruins of an empire that had lasted 15 years. The difference was not the territory, not the wealth, not the people. The difference was what the men who came after Alexander were willing to do that Alexander was not: sit still long enough to build something. The verdict on Alexander, if one insists on a verdict, is that he built an empire that could not survive him and a world that could not have existed without him. Those two things are not in tension. They are the same fact viewed from different distances. Up close, in the years immediately following his death, in the chaos of the Diadochi Wars, in the abandoned garrisons and the revolting satrapies, and the infant king murdered at 14, the failure is undeniable. Pull back further, across the centuries that followed, and something else comes into focus. A transformation so total, so irreversible, so generative in its consequences that the word failure becomes inadequate to describe it. Alexander did not build an institution. He built a world. In the Hellenistic age, the 3 centuries between Alexander's death and the Roman absorption of the last successor kingdom, was the direct product of his campaign. It was an age unlike anything that had preceded it, an age of Greek language and Greek culture spreading across territories that had never spoken Greek, an age of cities that blended Macedonian, Persian, Egyptian, Babylonian, and Indian traditions into forms that none of those traditions could have produced alone, an age of science and philosophy and commerce operating at a scale and across a geographic range that the classical Greek world had never imagined. Alexandria, Antioch, Seleucia on the Tigris. These were not Greek cities transplanted to foreign soil. They were something new, cities that the collision of cultures had produced and that Alexander's campaign had made possible by forcing that collision in the first place. The Greek language was the empire's most durable legacy, and it traveled further and lasted longer than any institution Alexander built. By the time of his death, Greek was already the administrative language of the Western satrapies, the language of commerce across the Eastern Mediterranean, and the language in which the intellectual life of his court was conducted. His successors extended that reach deliberately. The Ptolemies made Greek the language of their administration, the Seleucids seeded Greek-speaking cities across the Asian interior, the Antigonids maintained the Macedonian tradition from which the whole project had grown. Within a century of Alexander's death, a merchant traveling from Alexandria to Antioch to Seleucia could conduct business in Greek the entire way. Within 3 centuries, the authors of the New Testament wrote in Greek because it was the only language guaranteed to reach the entire world they were writing for. The cities Alexander founded, most of them named Alexandria, scattered from Egypt to the edges of India, were uneven in their immediate survival but transformative in their aggregate effect. Many did not outlast the Diadochi Wars. Some were absorbed into successor kingdoms and rebuilt from their foundations. A few became, over centuries, genuinely significant urban centers. Herat, Kandahar, and Merv all developed from Alexandrian foundations. The city of Alexandria in Egypt became the greatest city in the Mediterranean world within a generation of its founding, and remained one of the most important cities in the world for nearly a millennium. Alexander's city-founding instinct was militarily motivated: garrisons, supply depots, control points. But cities, once founded, develop logics of their own. They attract population, generate commerce, produce culture. Alexander planted seeds without intending gardens. The gardens grew anyway. The trade networks that the Hellenistic world developed were a direct consequence of the political unification, however temporary, that Alexander's campaign had imposed. For the 11 years of the campaign and the decades immediately following, goods moved across the old empire's territories in volumes and along routes that had not previously been possible. Indian spices reached the Mediterranean markets in greater quantities. Central Asian lapis lazuli moved westward through systems that the campaign had opened. Silk, whose ultimate origin in China was unknown to the Greek world, began appearing in the eastern Mediterranean through intermediaries whose access to the interior routes had been loosened by the collapse of the Achaemenid border system. The Silk Road, as later generations would name it, was not Alexander's creation, but its western reach, the network of cities and trade relationships that connected the Mediterranean to the Central Asian interior, was built largely on the infrastructure his campaign had opened. The encounter between Greek philosophy and the intellectual traditions of the East produced consequences that neither side could have anticipated. Greek scholars traveling with Alexander's campaign encountered Zoroastrian cosmology, Babylonian astronomy, Indian mathematics, and Egyptian medicine in sustained and serious ways for the first time. The Babylonian astronomical records, centuries of systematic observation of the night sky, far more comprehensive than anything the Greek world possessed, entered the Greek intellectual tradition through Alexandria, where Ptolemy's scholars translated and engaged with them. The resulting synthesis produced, within 2 centuries, the most sophisticated astronomy the ancient world had ever seen. The Indian mathematical tradition, particularly its treatment of large numbers and positional notation, that entered the Near Eastern intellectual world through the same channels. The Hellenistic scientific achievement, Euclid, Archimedes, Eratosthenes, Hipparchus, was not purely Greek. It was the product of the collision Alexander had forced. Alexander's campaign also changed the Persian world permanently, in ways that the subsequent Parthian and Sasanian Persian empires both inherited and struggled against. The Achaemenid Empire was gone, and it did not come back. No subsequent Persian dynasty attempted to reconstitute the Achaemenid model, even when Persian political power reasserted itself under the Parthians in the 2nd century BC. What came back was a Persian culture that had absorbed, metabolized, and in some cases rejected the Greek influence that Alexander's campaign had introduced. Parthian coins bore Greek legends for centuries. Parthian court culture maintained Greek theatrical traditions. The tension between Persian cultural identity and Greek influence, generated by Alexander's campaign, runs through the entire subsequent history of the Iranian plateau and shapes the cultural politics of empires that arose long after Alexander's name had passed from living memory into legend. The model of universal empire, the idea that a single political authority could and perhaps should govern the entire known world, was Alexander's most consequential political legacy and the most ambiguous. Before Alexander, the idea existed in various forms. The Achaemenid kings had ruled the world's largest empire with claims to universal sovereignty, the Assyrians before them, various other Near Eastern powers. But Alexander's campaign gave the idea a new intensity and a new geographic reach. He had actually done it, had actually unified, however briefly and imperfectly, the territories stretching from Greece to India under a single authority. The fact that the unity had dissolved within a generation did not diminish the conceptual achievement. If it had been done once, it could be done again. Or something like it could be done again, more carefully, more institutionally, more durably. Rome understood this explicitly. The Roman governing class of the last 2 centuries BC was saturated with Alexander. His campaigns were studied, his decisions were debated, his achievements were the standard against which Roman ambitions were measured. Julius Caesar reportedly wept before a statue of Alexander in Spain, at an age by which Alexander had already conquered the world. Augustus kept an image of Alexander on his signet ring. The Roman imperial system, the provinces, the legions, the emperor at the center, was a response to the same problem Alexander had faced and failed to solve. How do you govern an enormous, culturally diverse territory from a single center? The Romans solved it through law, through a standardized legal system that applied across the empire regardless of local tradition, through citizenship extended progressively to subject populations, through an infrastructure of roads and cities that created economic integration. They solved it, in other words, through exactly the institutional mechanisms Alexander had never built. They built those mechanisms with Alexander's example in front of them, both as inspiration and as warning. The figure of Alexander himself, separate from anything he actually built, became one of the most generative myths in human history. Within his own lifetime, his legend had already outrun the facts, the stories of divine birth, the oracle's confirmation, the personal invincibility. After his death, the legend accelerated. Within a century, a genre of Alexander romance, fictionalized, fantastical accounts of his campaign, had emerged in Greek and was being translated into languages across the known world. The Alexander romance, as scholars call the tradition, eventually appeared in over 80 languages, from Ethiopian to Mongolian to Old English. It was one of the most widely distributed texts of the pre-modern world. In it, too, Alexander became a figure of universal aspiration, the man who had gone to the edge of the world and perhaps beyond, who had sought immortality and faced death, who had loved his companions and lost them, who had wanted everything and found that everything was not enough. This was not history. It was something more persistent than history. A story about human ambition that different cultures across different centuries kept finding they needed. The Islamic world inherited Alexander as Dhul Qarnayn, the two-horned one, a figure mentioned in the Quran as a righteous ruler who traveled to the ends of the earth, built a great barrier against the forces of chaos, and was favored by God. Whether the Quranic figure is literally Alexander is debated, but the tradition that developed around the identification was vast. Poetry, philosophy, architecture, political thought, all organized around an Alexander who had been absorbed into Islamic civilization's self-understanding. Persian poets wrote of Iskandar, their name for him, as a philosopher king who sought the water of life and failed to drink it, dying mortal despite his greatness. The Mughal emperors invoked his lineage as a source of legitimacy. The Ottoman sultans saw in him a model of world-encompassing sovereignty. A Macedonian king who had died in 323 BC was, 12 and 15 and 17 centuries later, still organizing the political imagination of empires he had never heard of. Medieval Europe received Alexander through the Romance tradition and through the late Roman historians, and made of him a figure of chivalric virtue. The generous king, the loyal friend, the seeker of knowledge, the man undone by fortune rather than by his own choices. The moralists used him as a lesson in hubris. The chroniclers used him as a model of royal magnificence. Dante placed him in hell among the violent, but acknowledged his greatness. The Alexander of medieval Europe was not the Alexander of the Macedonian campaign. He had been translated, adapted, made to carry the moral and political concerns of cultures that had never heard of Bactria or the Hiphasis. But the fact that so many different cultures, across so many centuries, found in him a figure sufficient to carry their most important stories about power and ambition and mortality is itself a kind of legacy. Not political, not institutional, but human in a way that institutions rarely are. The judgment that Alexander failed because his empire collapsed within a generation is true and insufficient. It is true in the way that a narrow reading of a complex fact is true, accurate within its frame and misleading beyond it. The empire collapsed because it had been built without the institutional foundations that durability requires. That is a genuine failure, and nothing in Alexander's subsequent reputation should be allowed to obscure it. But the empire's collapse did not undo the transformation it had produced. The Greek language did not stop being spoken because Alexander died. The cities he had founded did not disappear because the Diadochi fought over them. The trade routes he had opened did not close because no single authority controlled them. Where the collision of cultures he had forced continued to produce consequences for centuries after the man who had forced it was buried in Alexandria. There is a harder version of the argument, and it deserves to be made directly. A slower Alexander, one who stopped after Issus, consolidated the Western territories, built genuine administrative infrastructure across Syria and Mesopotamia, appointed a successor, created a legal framework, might have held a Western empire together for a generation or two. He would not have reached India. He would not have forced the collision of Greek and Eastern intellectual traditions that produced the Hellenistic scientific revolution. He would not have opened the Central Asian trade routes whose activation transformed the commerce of the ancient world. He would not have seeded cities from Egypt to Afghanistan that grew, over centuries, into the nodes of a cultural network that connected the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. The institutional failure and the transformative achievement are not separable. They were produced by the same choices, the same refusal to stop, the same subordination of consolidation to momentum. You cannot have one without the other. Alexander knew on some level that he was not building to last. The signs are everywhere in the record. The refusal to name a successor, the plans for campaigns that would have taken decades to complete, the treatment of each territory as a staging ground for the next rather than a community to be integrated. Whether this was conscious or instinctive, whether he understood his own project clearly or was simply incapable of imagining a future in which he was not the central fact, cannot be recovered from the sources. What can be recovered is the shape of his choices, and the shape is consistent. He chose the campaign over the state, the horizon over the foundation, the next conquest over the consolidation of the last one. Every time, without exception. To the end. The tragedy, and it is a tragedy in the precise sense that the Greeks who invented the form would have recognized, is not that he died young. Men who died young had not, before Alexander, left the world permanently different. The tragedy is that the qualities which made his achievement possible were inseparable from the qualities that made his empire impossible. The speed that allowed him to outpace every enemy's ability to respond was the same speed that prevented him from building anything that could outlast his own presence. The personal magnetism that held the army together across 11 years of impossible conditions was the same magnetism that made institutional governance redundant. Why build systems when one man's presence made systems unnecessary? The self-conception so total that it functioned like a physical force was the same self-conception that made honest counsel impossible and succession unthinkable. He was the engine of his own achievement and the architect of his own failure, and the two were not in conflict. They were the same thing. To stand in Alexandria today, in the city that grew from lines drawn in grain on a January morning in 331 BC. And the question of whether Alexander succeeded or failed seems briefly beside the point. The city he chose still exists. The language he carried still shaped every major religion that emerged from the Mediterranean world. The idea of universal empire that he demonstrated was possible still organized political ambition for 2,000 years after his death. The collision of cultures he forced still reverberates in the intellectual traditions of half the world. He did not build institutions, he built conditions, the conditions under which other people, across other centuries, built the things that last. It was not what he intended. It was not what a statesman would have planned. It was what a force of nature leaves behind when it has passed through. Not a structure, but a changed landscape. Not a state, but a world. The question the ancient sources kept returning to, whether Alexander was the greatest man who ever lived or a catastrophe dressed in glory, was the wrong question, or at least an incomplete one. He was both, simultaneously, without contradiction, because the greatest and the catastrophic were, in him, the same. The world remembers him not despite the failure, but through it. Because the failure was spectacular enough, and the achievement vast enough, and the human story at the center of both compelling enough that 23 centuries have not been sufficient to exhaust what he means. Every generation finds in Alexander what it needs to find: the warning, the inspiration, the cautionary tale, and the impossible standard. He left no succession plan, no legal code, no fiscal system, no institutional framework. He left something rarer and less useful and far more lasting, a story that refuses to end. That is what he built. It was not nothing. It was not enough. It was Alexander.